Hey everyone, and welcome back to Hope with the Mind. I am your host, Kristen, and today more than ever, I need to be reminded of this topic for myself, learning to say no for our own mental health. If you've ever felt overwhelmed because you say yes to everything or guilty when you turn something down, this episode is for you. Today we're going to unpack why it's so hard to say no, how it affects your mental health, and most importantly, practical strategies to set boundaries without feeling guilty. So grab a drink and get comfortable and let's dive in. Let's start by talking more about why it is so incredibly difficult at times to just say no. One of my biggest struggles with saying no comes from being 100% a people pleaser. Many of us grow up believing that our worth is tied to how much we do for others. We say yes because we want to be liked. We say yes because we want to be accepted. We say yes because we want to avoid disappointing someone. And while being kind and considerate is wonderful, I found that constantly prioritizing others' needs put me on a fast track to burnout. I thought I could do it all. I thought I could please everyone and still have enough left in the tank to take care of myself. I was constantly loading not only my own plate, but also getting a second and third helping of responsibilities in order to meet obligations I had signed myself up for in the hopes of making those around me happy. But I was left feeling empty and drained, and most of my personal wants and needs unmet in my quest of pleasing others. Then came the guilt and obligation. I felt guilty for every single little task I was unable to check off. I felt guilty for every area I felt I had slacked in. I felt like I was letting everyone down, including myself. So this was my reasoning behind being unable to say no to literally anyone ever. For you or many others, it may be different pressures that make saying no difficult. Some feel that saying no makes them a bad person. Some have an intense fear of missing out, a fear that if they say no, they'll miss out on a once-in-a-lifetime chance or opportunity. Some struggle with cultural or faith-related pressures that influence them to constantly say yes, no matter the cost to them. Some come from backgrounds, cultures, or upbringings in which saying yes is seen as a duty, a responsibility, or even a virtue, or even that saying no is selfish, self-serving, uncaring, inconsiderate, or even rude. I want to reframe your thinking on setting boundaries. I want to rewire your thoughts on how saying no isn't rejecting others, but is in fact protecting yourself. So if you struggle with saying no, right now take a second. Pause this episode if you need to and ask yourself, why is it so hard for me to say no? Identify the root of your struggle to say no. As they say, acknowledgement is the first step toward change. Write it down if you need to. If it's people pleasing, write down a list of all the people in your life whom you try to please. Then list them in order of importance in your life and how much their opinion matters. I bet you'll find that the old saying is true. Those who matter don't mind, and those who mind don't matter. If it's fear of missing out, ask yourself, how many true opportunities have you missed by saying yes to opportunities that didn't really matter? If your reasoning is personal, cultural, or spiritual, ask yourself, have the yeses brought me personal, cultural, or spiritual growth? So what does it look like when we always say yes and never say no? Because believe me, constantly saying yes when you want to say no can take a serious toll on your mental health. As I said already, constantly saying yes put me on a swift path to burnout, which led to many other repercussions. So what are those consequences of saying yes all the time? 1. Increased stress, anxiety, and burnout. When you overcommit, your brain stays in a heightened state of stress. This constant stress increases our stress hormone called cortisol, which we'll talk more in depth in a later episode, but suffice it to say, when we constantly overload our plate, we put ourselves in a constant state of fight or flight mode mentally. This happens when we're juggling too many responsibilities and feeling like we can never catch a break. This often leads to resentment. I think most of us can attest that we have said yes to things and then later felt angry about it. That's resentment creeping in. Over time, this erodes your relationships because you feel overwhelmed and underappreciated. It affects how you treat people. Sometimes it affects how we treat the people we want to do things for because we have said yes to too many things and too many people that we don't want to say yes to. We've wasted our energy on things that didn't matter and then resent the things that do matter. Eventually, we begin to lose our identity. When we prioritize others' needs above our own, we lose sight of who we are and what we want. Our life becomes about making others happy instead of living with intention. And finally, this leads to an absolute breakdown of ourselves, complete burnout, and ultimately emotional exhaustion. Contrary to what you and I tried to convince ourselves, our emotional energy is not like bottomless chips and salsa. We do run out. It is a finite resource. If we keep giving it away without replenishing ourselves, we will eventually burn out. What does it look like when we reach this point of emotional burnout? Emotional exhaustion can manifest in different ways depending on the person, but there are some common signs and behaviors that point to burnout. So here's a breakdown of how those might look. Some emotional signs are snapping at others over small things or feeling unusually frustrated, feeling emotionally shut down or disconnected from things that used to matter, persistent worry or a sense of dread that doesn't seem to go away, becoming easily overwhelmed to the point of tears or even minor stresses. Hobbies or relationships that once brought joy now feel like obligations and chores. Some physical signs, feeling exhausted even after resting or sleeping. Trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, or waking up feeling unrefreshed. Physical tension often accumulates in the form of headaches, neck pain, body aches, and getting sick more frequently due to prolonged stress, weakening the immune system. Some behavioral signs are avoiding social activities or isolating from friends and family, struggling to complete tasks or feeling mentally foggy, using food as a coping mechanism or losing appetite altogether, overuse of social media, binge watching, substance use, or other escape tactics. And finally, some cognitive signs, difficulty focusing, difficulty remembering things or making decisions, increased self-criticism. Remember, every yes costs you something. The question is, are you paying too high of a price? I want to break down the psychology behind healthy boundaries. Boundaries are not about pushing people away. They're about protecting your mental and emotional well-being, and sometimes even your spiritual well-being. Here are a few psychological insights that can help you reframe how you think about saying no. Just like physical fences protect your home, emotional boundaries protect your mental space. Remember that no is a complete sentence. You don't need to over-explain or justify your no. It's okay to set limits simply because you need to. When you over-explain, you give others the chance to push back or argue. Practicing a simple, firm no helps reinforce your authority over your own life. Self-compassion matters. It is not selfish to prioritize your well-being. You cannot pour from an empty cup. Treat yourself with the same kindness you would offer a friend. If you wouldn't expect a loved one to run themselves ragged, why expect it of yourself? And when you set and maintain boundaries, you show people how you expect to be treated. Go back to the list you made in the beginning of this episode. Think of one situation where you need to establish a boundary. What would it feel like to say no? So let's get real. This is one of the things that is easier said than done. I can't count how many times I've told myself, I'm not going to say yes if they ask me. Then they ask me, and here I go, yesing like I've never yesed before. I'm also not going to sit here and act like I have my yeses and nos perfectly balanced. As I sit here and record this episode, I currently have too much on my plate. I was just speaking to my husband 2 days ago about how I thrive on stress. I don't really, but I've allowed myself to be overwhelmed and stressed for so long that I honestly don't know what to do with myself if I'm not overwhelmed and stressed. When I get 5 minutes to myself, I end up finding a new project to start. So let's talk about a few ways to start saying no more often and without guilt. Number 1, know your limits. Identify your emotional and mental capacity. What drains you? What restores you? Again, write a list if you need to. List 5 things that have you stressed out lately, and then list 5 things you can do or not do to feel restored. Use clear but kind language. Saying no doesn't have to be rude, disrespectful, or hurtful. Here are a few ways to say no politely. I can't commit to that right now. I'll let you know if that changes in the future. Or I appreciate the offer, but I have to pass. Number 3, utilize the pause technique. Don't answer immediately. Say, let me think about it and I will get back to you, to give yourself space to decide. Keep in mind you do need to get back with them one way or the other. Speaking as someone who has been left on red, so to speak, awaiting a decision that never came, it is polite to give someone an answer. Next, accept discomfort. It might feel awkward to say no at first. That's normal, especially if you're like me and you've been saying yes for way too long. You are retraining your brain to prioritize your needs. Lastly, practice self-affirmation. Remind yourself that your needs are valid and saying no is an act of self-care. Here are a few areas in which saying no is necessary and how that might look. In ministry, I know saying no is considered taboo. Many believe saying no in ministry is saying no to God. However, I fully believe you can't be successful in ministry in a state of burnout, and believe me, ministry burnout is real. If your service in ministry is keeping you from protecting your own spiritual walk with God, you need to consider stepping back and delegating. You cannot minister to others if your own walk with God has been compromised. Another area you might feel that you find it difficult to say no is toxic relationships. Whether these are romantic, family, or friendships, they often involve manipulation, guilt tripping, or other controlling behaviors that make saying no feel impossible or even dangerous. Here's what that looks like in practice. Have clear and direct communication. In toxic relationships, vague responses leave room for manipulation. Being firm and straightforward reduces ambiguity. You don't owe anyone a lengthy reason for your boundaries. When setting and maintaining boundaries, remember consistency is key. When you say no, follow through. Toxic people may test your limits repeatedly. Refuse guilt trips. Toxic people may use guilt to get their way. They may even tell you that your boundary or the enforcement of your boundary is a betrayal to them. Recognize it, but don't let it control your decision. And create physical and emotional distance. When saying no isn't respected, you may need to limit or cut off contact. Protect your energy by saying no when you're overwhelmed. Burnout prevention is all about maintaining a healthy balance, recognizing early signs of stress, and actively taking steps to preserve your mental, emotional, and physical well-being. Saying no to the wrong things gives you room to say yes to what matters. If saying yes means compromising your personal values or integrity, it's essential to stand firm. If a commitment negatively impacts your emotional well-being, saying no is an act of self-preservation. In Proverbs 12:25, it says, "Heaviness in the heart of man maketh it stoop, but a good word maketh it glad." Just like we guard our hearts spiritually, we also need to guard our emotional and mental health. This means recognizing when saying yes to everything is ultimately saying no to peace, joy, and balance. Isaiah 40:29 says, "He giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might he increaseth strength." Even in our weakness, God gives us strength, but we need to recognize when we need to rest and replenish ourselves, rather than constantly pushing beyond our limits. As we wrap up this episode, I want to leave you with this thought. Saying no isn't rejecting others. It's about respecting yourself. Your mental health matters, your needs are valid, and you have permission to prioritize your well-being. I challenge you to practice saying no at least once this week. And if you do, I'd love to hear about it. Share your experiences with me on social media or send me a message. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. And as always, take care of your mind, take care of your soul, and take care of yourself.